This video is going to be a review of homeostasis and negative feedback loops. We're going to be looking at various loops, so you should have some paper and a pen or a pencil ready to participate. Before we get going, these are some key terms that you should know, and you should be very comfortable with these before we even start looking at feedback loops. So pause the video and see if you can match up the words to the definition. These are the words that you have known: feedback, modulator, etc. So have a look, pause the video, see if you can match up the word with the definition, and then play it again and we'll go through the answers. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to write down the component of the negative feedback loop based on the definition. Here are the words that you should have got. If you are still unsure of what these words mean, I would strongly suggest that you make flashcards or some sort of mnemonic to help you understand and remember these terminologies. All right, so negative feedback loops are a way of controlling the internal environment and keeping it within tolerable limits. They maintain homeostasis within the body, and they involve those keywords that we just went through: stimulus, receptor, modulator, effector, response, and feedback. Points that you may want to consider before we go any further again are to understand what homeostasis is, why it's important in the human body, and what could happen if we do not maintain homeostasis. Hopefully you've got some notes on that. When we look at a negative feedback loop, what you need to understand is that the stimulus, so the thing that causes the change, usually a change in the internal environment if it's physiological, or it could be external environment when we look at temperature. We go through this series of steps that leads to a change that will correct what the stimulus was. So the stimulus and the feedback should be the opposite of each other. That's a quick way of checking that you're on the right track. All right, so now we're going to look at a series of negative feedback loops. First one we're going to be looking at is a physiological response to a decrease in body temperature. So think about what physiological means. We are talking about things that happen inside the body, various mechanisms that involve regulations such as vasodilation, sweating, shivering, and so on. It's important that you understand that before we move on. Okay, so it would be a good idea to sketch out a feedback loop. You should have enough spaces to draw in everything. Please note that you don't always get this nice circle when you're looking at exam questions of a feedback loop. Often it's represented as a rectangle or a square. The shape doesn't actually matter. It's ensuring that you have the response all the way around to feedback. So if we're looking at a decrease in temperature, that is our stimulus. So this is our change in the environment that is initiating this negative feedback loop. Second, we would have the receptor. So the receptors are cells that detect the change. Because it's temperature, we are looking at thermo or temperature receptors. It's important that you use the correct terminology to achieve the best marks. So we're going to be looking at thermoreceptors. And it's important that you state where these thermoreceptors are located, which are the hypothalamus. The modulator, which is also the hypothalamus, sometimes it can be the same thing, and that's fine. This sends out nerve impulses. Now, because it's a physiological mechanism, these are directing nerve impulses under subconscious control, and they will innervate the smooth muscle of the arterioles, sweat glands, and skeletal muscle. The response to these effector organs and glands being innervated are the following. So we have vasoconstriction, which of course is narrowing of the blood vessels. You should understand that narrowing of those arterioles is a way of reducing heat loss through radiation, conduction, and convection. The sweat glands reduce their activity, so we don't secrete that much sweat, so we're not losing a lot of energy through latent heat. And there is shivering, which is rapid contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscles. That friction and activity will generate heat energy. As a result of this response, our feedback mechanism is an increase in body temperature. Moving on to the next one, we're looking at the opposite situation. So instead of a decrease in body temperature, we're looking at the physiological response to an increase. Again, sketch out the feedback loop. Make sure that you have the stimulus through to feedback boxes there. It's always a good idea to label these boxes as stimulus, response, modulator, and so on. And that gives you a good setting for how you need to work and what you need to do. So, first thing we're going to be looking at is the stimulus. So an increase in body temperature has happened, so we may be approaching 38 degrees. Anything above 37 is above body temperature, which your body doesn't like. It could be dangerous. So therefore, the central thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect that change, and the modulator sends out nerve impulses again. So you should note here that we haven't really changed very much. So that's quite helpful in looking at feedback loops. The stimulus was different, but the mechanism of the receptor and the modulator working are similar. The effector organs, you'll notice this time we don't have skeletal muscle. It's just the smooth muscle of the arterioles again and sweat glands. The response that we're looking at here is vasodilation, so the opposite of vasoconstriction. These blood vessels will widen near the skin surface, allowing more heat to escape through radiation. So we are reducing the temperature that way. And sweat glands will secrete more sweat, therefore the latent heat energy in the sweat, when it's evaporated, is taken away from the skin surface, and our feedback is a decrease in body temperature. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at behavioral responses. So you should be thinking about what a behavioral response is and what areas of the brain that will engage. Pause the video here, see if you can sketch out a feedback loop, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at doing the feedback loop for a behavior response, and you've realized that for behavior, we are going to be engaging the cerebral cortex. So again, an increase in body temperature is our stimulus. That is still detected by the hypothalamus central thermoreceptors. They will detect that change in temperature. And the modulator here is slightly different. Again, the hypothalamus sends out nerve impulses, but because it's a behavioral change, it sends that information to the cerebral cortex. Here we make conscious decisions about what we want to do. So the cerebral cortex receives that information from the modulator, indicating that the body temperature has gone up, and the cerebral cortex will then send messages to the effector. Because it's a conscious decision that we're making, it is going to the skeletal muscles. Okay, so in the previous examples we looked at, it was mostly smooth muscles for the blood vessels. Here it's skeletal muscle. The response from the cerebral cortex is that the skeletal muscles move to carry out responses that we have consciously thought of. For example, drinking a cool drink. sitting in the shade, taking off layers of clothing, etc. As a response to that, we have the feedback, which is a decrease in body temperature. Okay, so that should be pretty straightforward for you. The key points here that you need to look at with all feedback loops: labeling each part of it: stimulus, receptor, modulator, effector, response, and then feedback to get back to our set point. Those are important to have into your feedback loops. What you should also be looking at is that the stimulus, like I've said before, is the opposite of the feedback. Okay, and the modulator sometimes is known as the control center. This dictates what happens. All right, so now we're going to be looking at the opposite behavioral response. This time it's to a decrease in body temperature. Again, pause the video, have a go at working through this, and then we'll go through your answers together. All right, so the stimulus here for this negative feedback loop is going to be a decrease in body temperature. The receptors, again, are the thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus. These are the central thermoreceptors. These detect the change in temperature. The modulator, again, is the hypothalamus, and this sends impulses to the cerebral cortex for conscious decision making, and this is carried out by the effectors. So remembering, effectors are always muscles or glands. This time we are looking at skeletal muscle because this response or this effector is driven by the cerebral cortex, the conscious decision-making part of the brain. The effector will lead to the response, again, conscious decision, and in order to increase body temperature, we will do something logical like have a hot drink, put on more clothes. We may even curl up, which will decrease the surface area to volume ratio, and that will minimize any heat radiation from the skin surface. The feedback will be the opposite of the stimulus, therefore it's an increase in body temperature. With this one, we are looking at hormonal changes. So these are more long-term changes because hormones, we know, don't work instantaneously the way that nerve impulses do, or nerve impulses work very fast. Hormonal responses take much longer, therefore we would associate these with long-term responses. Again, draw out your feedback loop and see if you can think about what hormone would be involved in temperature regulation. The clue here would be metabolic processes. Okay, hopefully you've realized that the hormone that will be driving this process is thyroxine. So thyroxine increases metabolic rate. We can work back from that and think about what hormones are involved into leading to thyroxine production going up. So our stimulus, again, always starting with the stimulus, is a decrease in body temperature. The hypothalamus has the central thermoreceptors. Yet again, nothing's changed there, but the modulator is different. So the hypothalamus releases thyroid stimulating hormone releasing factor, and this targets the anterior pituitary gland, which will then secrete thyroid stimulating hormone. It's important that you specifically mention anterior pituitary gland and thyroid stimulating hormone. You will not get the marks if you don't mention these things. Thyroid stimulating hormone then targets a specific endocrine gland, which is of course the thyroid gland. This is the effector in this case, as it will carry out the desired response, which is to increase thyroxine production. That will, over the long term, increase metabolic rate and thus lead to an increase in body temperature. So as you will probably assume, the next feedback loop we're going to be looking at is an increase in body temperature driven by a hormonal response. So pause the video and see if you can do this, thinking about what goes on in the hypothalamus. All right, so our stimulus, increase in body temperature. Again, the receptor hasn't changed. It's the hypothalamus central thermoreceptors that are located there. They detect that increase in body temperature. This time, instead of having thyroid stimulating hormone releasing factor, because we have an increase in body temperature, we are going to be releasing thyroid stimulating hormone inhibiting factor. That will prevent the anterior pituitary gland from releasing too much thyroid stimulating hormone. So our control center here is regulating how much thyroid stimulating hormone is secreted, and as a result, it will dictate how much thyroxine is released from the effector organ for thyroxine, which is the thyroid gland. The response is going to be a decrease in thyroxine production from the thyroid gland, and therefore, over time, this leads to a decrease in metabolic rate and hence a decrease in body temperature. That you need to get into your answers. I'm sure you've noticed that already. So it's important that you get these key terms in here. I've tried to help you by highlighting them in red. It would be a good idea to go back and review your notes if you're unsure of anything before tackling these feedback loops, but certainly do them. Practice makes perfect. Okay, so hormonal responses to an increase in blood glucose. The scenario where that would be happening would be after you've eaten a meal, so therefore your blood glucose has increased. The receptors this time change. So glucose is regarded as a chemical, hence it would be chemoreceptors, so chemical receptors that detect that change or deviation from the norm. And beta cells in the pancreas, specifically in the islets of Langerhans, detect that. The modulator in this case is the beta cells themselves, and these will secrete the hormone insulin. Insulin will target effector organs, which are the liver and skeletal muscle, body cells, and adipose or fat tissue. So there's three things here. This is slightly more involved. We created a mind map about this. I'll put a link in the description for this. But what you need to understand is chiefly, so I'll put that as A, the liver and skeletal muscles are stimulated by insulin, then body cells, and once these are all filled up, we then will use adipose as our storage. So insulin acts like a key to unlock the liver and skeletal muscles and body cells to take up excess glucose from the blood. The response is glycogenesis. So this is the formation of new glycogen in the liver. So that's A, corresponds. Body cells will take up glucose and store that fuel. And adipose tissue will convert excess glucose into fat cells for storage. As a result of this, we will then have a decrease in blood glucose concentration, so we get back to our set point. The next negative feedback loop we're going to be looking at is a decrease in blood glucose concentration. So this scenario would be you have maybe done a lot of exercise, or there's been a long time where you haven't had any food or you haven't had a meal. Thinking about the receptor cells, if you look back at your feedback loop for the increase in blood glucose, you should be aware that this time it's going to be alpha cells. Again, still in the islets of Langerhans, but they stimulate the release of a different hormone. Still chemical receptors, so the receptors are still chemoreceptors, and these chemoreceptors will stimulate alpha cells in the pancreas, in the islets of Langerhans, and the modulator in this case again are the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans, the pancreas. This time, glucagon, the hormone glucagon, is stimulated to be released. Now, glucagon does the opposite of insulin. However, it still targets liver and skeletal muscles, and it still targets body cells. We're not looking at fat this time. The response to glucagon is to raise blood sugar levels or blood glucose concentration. So therefore, the glycogen store in the liver and skeletal muscles is broken down. And the key word here we're looking at is glycogenolysis or glycogenolysis, however you pronounce it. And body cells will start to carry out a response called gluconeogenesis. So literally this means making new glucose. So if you don't have any blood glucose in your bloodstream and you've exhausted your glycogen store in your liver and your skeletal muscles, your body will then turn to fats and then proteins to break down these other macronutrients to produce new glucose as a respiratory substrate. As a result of these processes here, we end up with an increase in blood glucose. Okay, so that's a quick review of the negative feedback loops that you'll need to know. Here are the multiple choice, short answer and extended response questions from the past papers that you have access to. I highly recommend that you do all of these questions and pay particular attention to extended responses. It's a really good exercise to write out answers to these questions and self-mark. Looking at the marking key will help you to understand what your marker is looking for and also help you to identify any key points that you've missed.